Thank you, Shaykh Fadhlalla, for finding the time to have this extended conversation or dialogue, partly with your own biography, personal biography, but far more interesting is the way in which you evolved in terms of spiritual awakening and moving through the various phases and cycles. You were born in Karbala in 1937, I believe, to a family of well-known and well-established religious scholars in the Shia Islamic tradition. Your great-grandfather was one of the region's most notable grand ayatollahs. And through that line, there evolved a number of people who moved more towards the spiritual rather than the jurisprudential aspect of Islam. Through your grandfather, father, and uncles, do you feel that you were connected to this long tradition at an early age? Did you feel that?
I felt the atmospheres in our home because it was at the end of several generations where there had been traditions, there had been way of life that was very well established, taken for granted. So I remember from early childhood that the courtesies, the manners, the way of receiving guests, the way of feeding the poor or coming in the house, out, it was very well established and very as though normal. So I imbibed what was at that time to me as a child as a very enjoyable, healthy, extended family, because there were 4 homes connected with each other. And without being indoctrinated as to what was the family heritage or its religious or spiritual lineage, I was brought up in an atmosphere of confidence and awareness of one's conduct and visitors and others and helping and serving. So I felt part and parcel of the whole household, which was fairly extensive. So I must have imbibed that atmosphere of having come from a line of people who were regarded by that community and that society as leaders or elite in the religious and spiritual hierarchy.
In your book, which is a memoir, biography of called The Son of Karbala, which came out a few years ago, you described a quintessential pre-modern town in the sense of a life that was integrated, work, home life, religious life was integrated into a whole, and that while you were in your childhood, early childhood, this was, as it were, the defining features of life in that town, in that city, the interconnectedness between these various aspects of outer community life. Did that sense of interconnectedness also spill over into one's spiritual or inner life? Did you feel that there was a connection between the outer conduct and people's inner realities?
The idea of spiritual life or religious life being separate from day-to-day life only began to occur to me much later. I never saw, I grew up in an atmosphere that they were seamless. And also the neighborhood, the extended, if you like, township and what all of the things around us, the 7 or 8 mahallat of Karbala. I really grew up feeling that this is a very well integrated city where there was no crime, where there was no thievery, there was no, I never heard even a quarrel outside the home or anywhere else. So I took it for granted that this is what it is everywhere else. The shock of the shocks came also, especially when I left Iraq at a young age for scholarship to Europe. Baghdad and other visits didn't also shake me out of that illusion that every town or every city, the people are respectful of each other, they know their position in life, helpful to each other. A lot of exchanges and bartering without it being also strict barter. So I grew up in an atmosphere that was really at the end of a caravan that had been, if you like, evolving for hundreds of years without me knowing that. Spiritual life, religious life, conduct, day-to-day commerce, they were seamlessly connected.
Looking at the memoirs of others of that period of the time, it was, as it were, a generalized condition in that part of the world, that there was no clear distinction or division, nor should there have been a clear distinction and division. When did the beginnings of this disruption, this juncture, as it were, take place?
Where it began, and in my particular case, I saw the huge gap within 2 to 3 years when I left for scholarship to Britain, and when I came back. It was as though it was suddenly just abruptly broke. Of course, I had grown up a bit more. My understanding of life and outside world changed. But I really noticed that within 3 or 4 years, there was nothing left there whatsoever of what I knew or what I was familiar with.
So, to what do you attribute the fact that you had this generations-long stability, all of a sudden abruptly cracking, and then the younger people turning themselves away from it?
Yeah. I think Karbala was to a great extent like a city-state. And once the Iraqi government and the political, if you like, cohesion of the country and the oil or whatever other revenue began to come, and the central government, it was a self-governing city until I think the effect of the central government and the effect of that came to the city. I think I would say that this long caravan of hundreds of years, interrupted every now and then by invasions from other neighboring places or certain disasters, natural disasters like floods or whatever. I think really the final thing was with the central government.
I mean, you mentioned in our earlier conversations that you went through World War II without knowing there was a World War.
I, as a kid, again, being an extended household, so there was one room dedicated for tea and coffee. It was called Sanduq Khana, where there was 2 or 3 big boxes where the packets or boxes of teas were kept and coffees and so on. And there would always be hot boiling water on top of a stove. And I remember there were 2 or 3 pots or bowls of sugar. And I, as a kid, will go there, and I suddenly noticed one of the bowls of sugar was brown sugar. And I preferred it actually to the white. So when I heard somebody, a town crier, crying that the war is over, so I asked, I said, what does it mean the war is over? They said, don't you remember the brown sugar? This is because of the war. That is about all.
Extraordinary. I mean, it must have been a very comforting
self-sustaining town. Everything was made there. Cloths were made there. Shoes were made there. Leather would come raw. There were 7 or 8 different districts where you have the artisans, a bit like what you have in North Africa and Fez, for example, which has been preserved as a World Heritage. It was like that. There was one area was mostly leatherwork, shoes, and so on, and they will make it for you as you want. And other is cloth makers, merchants, other than the grain and the food. It was very much of a self-sustained town. And every week or 2 or 3, there will be a large caravan of the desert nomads and Bedouins that come to the edge of the town. And there was one particular camp, few minutes away from our own home, where 20, 30, 50, 100, sometimes a few hundred camels, depending on the size of the camel thing. And they will bring their goods to the town to buy and sell. They buy tea, they buy tobacco, a few other things, matches, and they load. To take usually a couple of days or 3 days. For me, that was one of the most enjoyable sights. So one of the servants will take me to see. And what amazed me also, how the family, the husband, wife, and occasionally the kids, will be totally cooperating in the activity of offloading and unloading. And the women's influence was considerable. I mean, the wife was completely as though in her own right doing her things, and there was a partnership. Unlike our own homes in the city, where the woman was much more in hijab and in the house. And so I used to enjoy these caravans. And this was part of the, if you like, commercial lifeline between Karbala and the outside world and the desert world. So these people will bring a lot of goods, a lot of leather, a lot of hair, a lot of this and that, and would exchange it. It was a very living town. And of course, the biggest industry of the town was burying the dead. On average, I would imagine as a kid, every day there will be 20, 30, 50 dead bodies being brought to Karbala to be buried either near the shrine of Imam Hussein or in the main public cemetery, which was in the sprawling desert. And as the dead body is taken through, you find people from shops or wherever they hear it or they see it, they jump out in order to hold the dead bodies joining into that. And this again following a tradition that if you do that, imagine yourself dead in the box rather than. So it was a very unusual atmosphere. Death, life in between, without a great deal of noise. I mean, what struck me most after I left is that I had not come across a crime in the whole city. And I don't remember there were any courts, I hardly remember seeing a policeman.
This passage in early youth through this, in many ways, one would call a kind of utopia, in the sense of balance and equilibrium and serenity, and a twinning of one's inner and outer life. It must have left an extremely powerful imprint on you. And that, would you say that part of your subsequent life was an attempt to regain part of these certainties that were imprinted on you?
Not consciously, because I knew it is done and it's gone. Because I remember as a kid asking Imam Hussein, should I stay in Iraq, can I leave? And it was very clear to me that no, things are not going to be at all what I was used to, and I should get out. So I felt really that I cannot reproduce any of that. And the biggest shocks to me were actually the cultural shocks from what I was used to, took it as normal, to what was very much of a Western world, which was Britain, so to speak, soon after the war.
I mean, here you have a relatively stable, trouble-free, serene childhood, and suddenly drastic change enters into the equation. How do you see change? How do they impinge on the individual? Is an individual seeking permanent stability?
No doubt. I seek permanent and utter peace and constancy and predictability. But equally, I also know in every way that this world we are living in, the world of space and time, essentially a world of change and constant change. So I learned by practice also that the more I refer to my inner constancy, the more I can have a better perspective regarding the change. The bigger is the change or the shock, I think the easier it's for me to rationally deal with it or dismiss it or whatever by referring to the zone within me, which is not subject to change.
This abrupt break, a disjuncture or discontinuity, either embrace the idea of perpetual change or try to seek some form of stability in a backward-looking traditionalism. Did that ever affect you?
I think it is there. I personally also have, for many years, tried to interact with the change, see the upside of it and the downside of it, but also try and go into my innermost stillness rather than any backward or any illusory or fantasy idea of how the world was perfect. I never ever believed as a child or subsequently that the past was better than the present or worse. I never have this notion. I think the perfection is there always, imperfection is there always. It's just the extent of it and the impact of it upon people changes. I think I somehow remember it even as a kid, knowing that nothing that I like I can keep for long, and yet I want to have access or to have a state where I feel happy or content with. And from childhood, I think the sound of Quran and things like this also, which was all the time recited from the shrine, which was directly, we had no separation between our homes and the mazar of Imam Hussein. I remember that sound had a big effect upon me, always like a tranquilizer. And I remember later on myself also taking on to reciting a line or two just to give me that calmness.
So would you say that in your early childhood, you did not have a direct experience of duality, that there are opposites?
I did, often by also abusing my, overeating nuts or whatever goodies that I like. No, I remember, I didn't intellectualize it as I do now, that the whole of existence is based on opposites. But no, I have realized the swing between, what is good and what is bad and what is healthy or not. No, I was aware of all of that, and I tried, as I said, to deal with it as best as I can.
I mean, most people have this sense of security, stability, and then all of a sudden they have to deal with change and flux.
Yes.
And would the tools, as it were, with dealing with change and flux, are they established when you're very young, or do they need to be acquired subsequently?
Acquired subsequently, but I think the seeds of it must have been there. Because I remember at the time of cultural shocks in Britain, I would often prefer to be quiet and settle down my agitation and mental anguish or whatever, quieten down slowly and to get replenished. So I think I got used to it fairly early on, that the source of the referencing to quietness and balance is within me. And some people also were helpful to me to be with. Some others, as you may say now, bad chemistry, or they irritate you. So that too was there.
Well, speaking about chemistry, your father was one of the most well-known alchemists. How did that affect you when you saw him in his laboratory? Did you ask him what he was doing?
I knew what he was doing from what I've heard a lot about what he was doing from others. It was in the family. I think it has been there for many generations. Several of his older relatives have had big accidents, blow up, and one of his cousins went blind, and so there were several of them within that lineage. I was not intrigued. I took it as part of day-to-day life. He would go every morning for half an hour or so, and every afternoon also, in order to put on a furnace or switch off something. And there were a lot of liquids bubbling and creating a lot of dreadful smells. No, I knew that he is up to something special, and he was obviously passionately connected with it. And every year or so there will be somebody visiting, often an odd person from some country or another, in order to exchange with him about the inner secrets of alchemy. No, it was part of the package of where I was born. I didn't find it exceptionally odd, or I felt also there would be others in the country or elsewhere who would be doing the same thing. Then later on in life, I remember him saying that that's it, it is done, and what he was after he had realized. And obviously it was not turning every piece of metal into gold either. But there were telltale signs that something also had happened physically. And I remember him in a discussion with someone on that issue. He said, ultimately, the philosopher's stone is you. You have to realize that it is all that. But to get to that point, you need to have been through a lot of cul-de-sacs and a lot of disappointments. And to bring, I remember also talking about patience. He says, once your patience becomes infinite, then you are at the edge.
So would you say the practice of alchemy, astrology, anything in which the action itself is in order to seek out signs of the sacred or divinity, once it loses that focus, becomes a pointless exercise? Yeah. Would you agree with that?
I'm sure. Well, I think that's how it was in his case. Yes. It wasn't after an outcome. outwardly out. It was after, producing gold and making, having wealth or something. I knew for sure it wasn't that, because all of his other behavior was also not concerned with such outcomes. Because I remember there were a number of occasions where he was offered a lot of things, places, homes. For example, there were a lot of property in different parts of Iraq that people came to him, they said this is being claimed because the people are living there without rent for 20 years, and now the new law, they can claim it. He said, well, they deserve it. So I remember a number of people in his in his company saying, but look, this is yours and your families and so on and so forth, and you could use the money for other charities, whatever. He said, this is the best charity, they are there. So there were a lot of such opportunities. So I knew there wasn't the element of making money or getting wealth and so on, wasn't at all on his agenda.
So any material outcome, transubstantiation of metals and one into the other,
No.
was never...
I think it was the process.
And the process is to find traces in science.
Yes. I was not really in any way initiated into that, nor was I really interested, but I knew it was about his inner deep, if you like, transformation of some sort. I didn't know what it meant.
But you knew intuitively, or how?
I felt that he is pursuing something that is the most important in his life, and it has no visible outcome that I can gauge.
Later, during your high school or secondary school years, you excelled in the academic field, and you were then offered a scholarship to study in England. When you arrived in England, which is probably the antithesis of Karbala, did you have what is known as the shock of the modern? Were you in a state of...
I still am in that shock. Absolutely. No, it was, absolutely, no.
How did you see England? How did you see this entirely different society and culture? How did you relate it to the one that you had left behind?
There were things I had to do. The morning I had to go to the college to take notes. The few things that shocked me most were actually like queuing for food. I considered that to be very demeaning. Standing up in a line for minutes or whatever in order to have few peas in those days were still a bit of potato or something in your plate, which I never liked anyway. So I felt quite a number of their habits to what I was used to culturally were quite an anathema. But I adopted to it. I had to survive. So
and then you maintained for a while your religious practices and rituals.
For the first 2-3 years, I think I was very much, for example, I couldn't be away for too many hours in case I need to go to the bathroom for ablution, for whatever, to be on wudu. But it fell off after 3-4 years. I began to lapse.
Lapse because you didn't find any utility in them, or because something
slowly
else
by slowly it got
them?
eroded, and there was nobody else to keep me, in a way, in line or encourage. Slowly by slowly, I began to miss it. The timing wasn't right. Maghrib, you are in a lecture or in a something, so
just
it lapsed.
Away. Also, I think the 1950s was not a particularly religious phase in time, so that
Yes, no.
lots of those who had learned these practices probably abandoned
Yes.
them at that time. Then you came back to Iraq armed with a degree in, I think, science and applied chemistry, and you joined the Iraq Petroleum Company, where you rose meteorically in the ranks and were slated for the highest posts. What was then, in this period, in your early to mid-20s, I suppose, did you try to maintain a sense of spiritual engagement, as it were, or were you also focusing on your work and on your family, your young family?
Very much ambition to excel, do the best possible in my profession, family, their education, my well-beingness, enjoying life as a, young, if you like, oil company executive. But I had always had a soft spot, if you like, for the spiritual or religious side, wherever I could find it. including in the oil company. There was a Jesuit man called Father Haeri, Frenchman, was I think probably the head of the Jesuits in Baghdad. He would visit the oil company once every couple of months, stay for a week or longer. He was doing a lot of research on the Assyrians in Iraq. And I really adored that man. I think it was reciprocated. He was much older than I. And it was an unusual, if you like, friendship, deep, deep, deep friendship. And there were quite a number of incidents and people like that, including some of my own staff who were below me rank-wise. But I found their religious and spiritual piety or whatever so appealing. So I would be more with them because of that. So it wasn't formal that I'm seeking something, but I was naturally attracted to, there would be at least once every 2-3 weeks some shepherds from outside the fence of the compound with their sheep. And I would love to go, Kurdish mostly. I would love to talk to them. And what separated us was this electric wire fence, which was very high. And somehow I'd managed to get out of the compound, sit with them or walk with them. I've always loved the simple, the clean people on the outside, or the sophisticated people like this top Jesuit, for example, without a great deal of sophisticated discussion or exchange. You know, I could just feel empathy and love for them. It remained with me. I can remember many incidents from people who were not of any similar type of background. But there was that inner feel that these people have got another dimension that is alive.
Which was never lost in you, or it could never be lost.
Supposed to. But for me, it was always a big, big attraction. Older people, poorer people. I've always enjoyed being with them. All the time.
Then towards the end of the 1960s, you saw the beginning of the end for this foreign enclave with its special privileges and its special lifestyle, and you hastened to depart, even though you were asked to stay because you're on the fast track to becoming, as it were, the chief executive of this enterprise. What made you see that this project was doomed?
I think it was an erosion again over a period of maybe a year or two. I found it so artificial, us living in such a pampered environment and just separated by a fence from what was perhaps biblical time or before even. And so there were so many indications that impinged upon me that made me actually physically ill. I became ill for several months, digestive problems, gastric issues. I was not happy. Looking back at it, it was perhaps the most miserable time in my life. Outwardly, here I am, pampered, promised this and that your progress, your this and that. But I felt inwardly empty, unhappy, miserable. Also, I felt this is not sustainable. Iraq is not sustainable. I felt the whole thing is months on end. I would feel that I am sitting on a volcano. So until I found the earliest opportunity, because I wasn't allowed to leave also. At that time I was in a sensitive job, evaluating the reserves and establishing optimum techniques for extraction, linear programming and all of that things in mathematics. So I was doing a very critical job. I was under a huge, if you like, focus from the authorities, not to leave, not to do this. So I couldn't leave in any way. So eventually I had to enroll in a postgraduate course. And I had to get the approval of everybody, which happened very quickly. And I left.
So it wasn't just the sense that a prescient analysis of the outer conditions that this is doomed. It was more to do with the fact that you were deeply unhappy and unsatisfied.
I was caught from every angle. Physically, mentally, culturally. I just felt completely out of sort, out of place, out of time. And I didn't know what was the answer either, but I knew this is not. I had to, it was really that this is not it. Get out, irrespective. That's what I did.
Just that action itself, did it leave you satisfied or still dissatisfied?
I'm still dissatisfied even now. But no, it's all relative. It was very satisfactory. Because also the Iraq Petroleum Company was still after me to go back. So that gave me a bit of a security that, look, if the worst comes to the worst, I can go back on better terms. But I knew this is not the right thing to do. I knew this is retrograde, and I should just have patience and a bit of courage. And it took a while. I mean, patience and courage were not that easy also to give me that contentment. It was tough. But I was delighted to have done